My name is Cynthia Carr, and I'm a writer and the author most recently of Candy Darling, Dreamer, Icon, Superstar.
I'm Vivian Bond. I'm a cabaret performer and visual artist.
From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
I mean, I really needed to know what she was going through, or to me, it couldn't be a real biography. You have to go into all the aspects of a person that if you can get to them. And I did, I went to every archive and every person that I knew of who had ever met her.
Being photographed by Avedon, being in a Warhol movie, those are all validations. They don't feed her. They don't make her life any more normal. But I think she yearned for a normal life, but I doubt if she ever expected to have one.
I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today. Hey everybody, it's Helen. I'm joined today by biographer Cynthia Carr, author of Candy Darling, Dreamer, Icon, Superstar, and the acclaimed cabaret performer Vivian Bond, who is the voice of the audio version of this terrific book. Candy Darling is a trans icon, a Warhol superstar. She was name-checked in a Lou Reed song, photographed by Richard Avedon and Peter Hujar, and Tennessee Williams even wrote a play for her. In other words, Candy was just short of everything. Given the current administration's demonization of trans people, I hope this episode is a bit of a tonic, proof that trans people have always existed, and an example of how trans stories are an integral part of our culture writ large. Happy listening. Cynthia, Viv, I am so happy to have you both here to talk about Candy Darling, the biography that you've written and the biography that Cynthia's written, Viv, that you have read. I was at a dinner table this summer in Provincetown. I was about halfway through reading it, and almost everyone else at the table was listening to it. I read the first half and then finished it out listening to Viv, you read it. I thought maybe the first thing we could do is, Cynthia, could you just describe in a few sentences who was Candy Darling?
Candy was a Andy Warhol superstar, an actress in films, but really mostly in theater, and really a transgender icon because she was visible when most trans people were not visible. And I think she was very brave in doing that. But I'm not sure she had a choice. I think that's who she was, and that's who she had to be. And she did it. And she had some rough times because of it. But she's, to me, a very important figure.
And Viv, when did you first hear about Candy?
That's a good question. It might have been when I read Jean Stein's biography of Edie Sedgwick, because I worked at a Walden Books when I was in high school, and it's probably about the same week that book came out. The hardback version arrived, and in the bookstore. And as soon as I opened the box, I was, of course, mesmerized by the cover because that's the kind of reader I am. I do judge books by their cover. But I took that home, and that's how I sort of really learned about the Warhol scene. And I'd seen photographs of Viva and Holly and probably Candy, but it probably didn't register that Candy was a trans woman until after I read about her.
It's my understanding, Cynthia, that you requested specifically that Viv be the reader of the audiobook. Is that correct?
The publisher sent me a couple of audition tapes that people had done and asked me what I thought. And I thought, boy, I just wasn't really into either one of them that much. And I wrote back and I said, why don't you get Justin Vivian Bond? But I just knew from seeing you as a performer, I just knew she could do it. So they asked you, and I was thrilled that you said yes.
I didn't have to think about it, really.
How did you prepare to do this book? What did you do?
I just looked at some YouTube videos that I could find, and that was it. I'm good at cold readings. And I just felt, I had to take a lot of breaks because it was so emotional.
Right. What quality of emotional was it for you, if you don't mind my asking?
Well, sometimes it would be anger, and I would be so enraged that I needed to take a break so that I wouldn't just pinch up. There was one character who I really got very, I was like, oh, this is a pissy old gay man, and I'm going to sound like a pissy old gay man. And I was like, oh, I was so angry at the moment. Then there were other times where I just had to stop because it was so heartbreaking that I just would sob, and I'd be like, okay, I need a break because it's just brutal, and I could relate so much to it, and the humanity that these people lacked was it's still shocking. It's not something that it's ever going to go away.
There are parts of this book that I can't possibly read out loud because I'll start crying.
Cynthia, I wondered if you could do us a favor and read from the introduction of your book. The sentence begins, "But the name."
But the name? An evolving trans movement hasn't reached consensus about whether to even acknowledge the old name. Some trans people say the life I lived as a gender that didn't feel right under a name that wasn't appropriate is part of my story and my struggle, and don't erase my history. Others say the name I chose is my name for the duration of my life, and to call me by the name and the gender assigned to me at birth invalidates my identity, and that feels like an assault. As a biographer, I have had to ask myself whether I can really use the name that Candy hadn't yet chosen when discussing her childhood. Isn't it misleading? Isn't it false? What made sense to me in the end was to consider what Candy would have wanted. Her disconnection from her birth name and her statement that it doesn't matter who we were, only who we are. These are imperatives I have to honor. So I am calling her Candy. However, her family and childhood friends spoke of her as Jimmy and son and brother and he, him. To change their words is not to deny the context that surrounded her, the disorienting childhood she had to negotiate while living in a homophobic, transphobic world with a boy's name and a boy's body. I have not sanitized that context. The two different names applied here during the chapters about her childhood illustrate the friction between who she really was and how she was perceived, and of course, what's real about a name. This is a story of becoming Candy. The word trans implies a journey.
I was really overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit at a moment when people are very mean and fighting with each other about language, to just sort of open yourself up like that. And it meant for me, if trans is a journey, then it's a journey for all of us. Like, I felt actually included in the journey that you laid out. What does it mean, or how do we even have an identity before there is language for what's happening to us, or or how do we have identities in the absence of certain kinds of language?
I'm just going to riff here because I don't have an answer to that question. But one thing I do know that I experienced as a trans child was that you don't have your identity defined until somebody contradicts who you think you are. For instance, I would do certain things when I was a kid. Well, boys don't do that. And I would think, well, I do that. So I'm either not a boy or boys do this. And so the desire to express yourself, if you are trans or you believe yourself to be a girl, and the boundaries that people or boxes that people put you in that you're trying to fight yourself your way out of. Some people have more, I guess, more of an ability to just subvert their identity in order to be safe, and some people don't. And that's why some people get to be called heroes and some people commit suicide because the pressure to deal with that is different people have different levels of consciousness or strength or just having a system of people around you who make you feel like you exist or that you're seen. I was fortunate that I had a grandfather who just allowed me to wear my grandmother's clothes and told me I looked beautiful. But my father got in big fights with him because my father was very upset when that would happen. So it was confusing, but I quickly learned that if I wanted to be safe and make my parents happy, I had to subvert that, which I did when I was around them. So I basically learned how to fool people really early and play the game so that I could get through whatever barrier they were trying to put up or
Right.
work my way around it, which is
Right.
one thing I think trans people are really good at is workarounds.
There's a resiliency in Candy's story that your book points to again and again, that she's constantly figuring out how to work against every odd that is put, every obstacle that is put in front of her.
And she makes a comment at some point that she was miserable in kindergarten. So, she was already being noticed as someone who was supposed to be a boy and wasn't quite acting the way boys are supposed to act. And another statement that was in her journal, I was a recluse at 7. She really suffered, I think,
I joked with people over the summer as I was telling them that they had to read it. I said, it's Candy Darling given the Winston Churchill treatment. It feels like every day, every letter, every person she ever spoke to. I mean, it is a really extraordinary feat of writing. It's so rich in detail. And yet there is something about Candy that remains inscrutable, that remains unknowable.
She presented herself in public as sort of an enigma, I mean, she would lie, and when she went to her mother's house, which was really her home base her whole life, she would say, well, I'm going to my country home. And I know for myself when I write, I mean, I wrote a biography before this, and I feel like I can't do a biography unless I can get some sense of the person's inner life. And for that, in Candy's case, I had her journals. And that's where she talked about her feelings of really despair. And she would talk about even that later in her life, her feelings of maybe I should die. Mm-hmm. She never told that to people, and one of her close friends, who was named George Abbagnalo, spent a lot of time with her. And he was talking about the Lou Reed song, Candy says, I hate my body. And he goes, she didn't hate her body. And I thought, oh yeah, she did. It's in her journals, written out, despise my body. And so she didn't, she wouldn't talk to people she hung out with a lot about what she was feeling in that way. But to me, it was, I had to have stuff like that. I mean, I really needed to know what she was going through. Or to me, it couldn't be a real biography, You have to go into all the aspects of a person that if you can get to them. And I did, I went to every archive and every person that I knew of who had ever met her to talk to and, to look at old records and stuff. So I think I got as much as could be gotten about her life.
Viv, when you were doing the reading, you take on a kind of persona for Candy. How did you feel when you're reading her diaries, giving this inner life that she herself was less disclosive of? What was that like for you?
Well, it was a bit of a challenge because I wasn't sure how far to go with having a voice for Candy or to try and have voices for other people. But because there were no visuals, I was trying to find ways to make it a distinct sound between the narrative voice and the characters of the people, like her mom or Holly or that sort of thing. I'd met Holly, but I didn't want to overdo it, you know. But I had this, I have this friend, Michael Cavadias, who he was obsessed with Candy Darling. And he told this story, which is what I think of when I came up with that voice, which was in one of the films. Penny Arcade says to her, "Don't you know that I was molested as a child?" And Candy said, "Well, how would I know?" And Michael used to tell that story. And so I was really actually doing Michael's impersonation of Candy when I narrated the book.
Oh, that's really great. That's great.
I know I asked Candy's friend Jeremiah, did she ever talk in a different way from the we see her in these movies and a little bit in that documentary called Beautiful Darling. She's in some, non-movie parts there. And was her voice ever different when she was like off stage or something? He said, no, that was her voice.
Candy Darling suffered an astonishing amount of rejection, an astonishing amount of hardship. She's, even when she kind of makes it and she's in an off-Broadway play, the women won't have her in the dressing room, the men won't have her in the dressing room. She ends up in a broom closet. She puts a star on the front door. She's resilient, but there's also just the sense of tragedy. And I wanted to ask you both, what do you think the mechanisms are that we have for, on the one hand, registering the extraordinary difficulty of the lives of trans people, their history, their reality, but without letting tragedy become a kind of trope and as part of the trans narrative?
The other thing that's in here is that you see Candy when she's in a rage. I mean, she does express that. I mean, sometimes at the wrong target, like her friend Jeremiah or whatever. But to me, it's her rages are completely explained by the way she's been treated.
I think you either give up or you don't,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't give up, you make calculations. Is this worth becoming vulnerable for? If she was in this show written by Tennessee Williams and she's got this horrific woman in the show, I think she knows that the woman's a horrific woman. She just sort of rises above it and realizes that she's in a play by Tennessee Williams and nobody else is in that part. So she's going to make the most of it. And that's all you can do. You can just, again, it's the workaround. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes you take the risk and it becomes even more painful than you expected. And sometimes it leads to unexpected rewards.
In that incident where the only other woman in the cast is screaming at her, "Get it out of here," when she's in the dressing room, "Get it out of here." She's saying to the stage manager. And Candy's response to it was to, laugh and say, I mean, she wasn't going to let anyone see how much it hurt her, and then she's the one who put the star on the door when she was put into a broom closet.
She's terrible teeth. Her teeth are falling out. She never has a stable address. She's like literally homeless. But Avedon and Peter Hujar are taking her picture. Lou Reed is singing songs about her. She's hanging out with the Rolling Stones. Like on the one hand, she has the most enviable life you've ever seen. And on the other hand, she's hungry.
Being photographed by Avedon, being in a Warhol movie, those are all validations. They don't feed her. They don't make her life any more normal. But I think she yearned for a normal life, but I doubt if she ever expected to have one.
She would talk about wanting to move to have the white picket fence and a husband and even children. She would talk about that as a sort of fantasy of what she wanted. Also, even at the end of her life, where she would, at one point when she was sick, she said to Jeremiah, "Well, I'm going to get better and I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave town and I'm going to have this whole new thing. I'm going to get married." And I mean, there were points in working on this where I thought, I could make a list of all the people who were mean to her and all the people who were really kind to her. It's like really, these opposite things, like Lily Tomlin's girlfriend or wife, Jane Wagner, paying for her to get her teeth capped, and sending, I'll go to my dentist, I'll pay for it. People like that coming through for her. Warhol really liked her.
But he was also awful to her at times. There are a lot of people that could have been on both lists.
Yeah.
One of the things that your book does really beautifully is sketch the milieu of New York, of avant-garde art, Warhol's factory, off and off Broadway plays, a kind of downtown scene. And one of the things that recurs through that in the 60s and 70s is the kind of persistence of the 30s and 40s. Like Candy is obsessed with a certain kind of Hollywood icon that is really a 30s and 40s image. Like she loved Kim Novak. Like she wanted to sort of be this icy, cool blonde, this silver screen image. I'm curious about all of that.
There's a part at the end where she's in the hospital and someone comes to interview her, and which turns into a short story. Julia Baumgold is the writer. And she explained then, Candy explained, because I talked to Julia Baumgold, she said everything that's in there that's a quote from the character in the short story is an exact quote from Candy. So she explained her attachment to Kim Novak at that point. And it was that she was beautiful but frozen. She was scared, and I was scared all my life. And there was something unacceptable about her. And, something like that. And I felt I was unacceptable in some way. So this is sort of a deeper reading. It's beyond like the hairdo or whatever. She loved those movies and knew some of them by heart practically. It's just the version of womanhood that she thought she wanted to be.
And at that time, there was a whole 70s, 30s trend. So many of the old movies were just coming around to television. Vintage clothing stores had, at that time, so many of the glamorous clothes that women from the 20s and 30s had, given away. And so you could go and rifle through the vintage clothing stores and find all of this great, bias cut dresses and that sort of thing.
And they were really cheap.
So I'd like to end with something forward-looking, because it seems to me that this book will occupy a place in our collective understanding about trans history, but also trans futures. And given how much Candy struggled to have a place and to have language, to have an identity without language to support it, I guess I wondered where both of you felt about the language we have now.
I do make a point of talking in here about how the words weren't even being, like non-binary wasn't a word then, or even transgender. People were referred to as transsexuals, usually, up until like the 90s. And there's been such a huge change since Candy's life.
And I would say that it's important to remember that language is policed. I mean, we come up with words and phrases and concepts and ideas as we evolve as a human species. But then there are people that do their best to make those words disappear. The last time Trump was in office, they were supposed to remove the word gender from all government websites and that sort of thing. So, as we came up with words like they, them, the right appropriates those words to vilify those words. So when you come up with something that describes somebody that's trans or other, or gives us more space to find language to be ourselves, there are the people there that are trying to shut that down as much as they can. And so it's like a constant evolution of how we can describe ourselves, because we just pivot, at a certain point in my lifetime. If the word tranny was something that we as sisters called each other, but then at a certain point, this person decided that that wasn't a good word, that it was offensive, that it was, dehumanizing to trans women. And then all of us sisters were no longer allowed to call ourselves that. So we moved on to something else. But I think, it's important to find ways. And because of the internet and because of the way culture is formed now, we are able to make those assertions and to discover those things together and to put the concepts and ideas into people's minds. It's just something that we have to just keep at.
Thank you both so much for this incredible work. Cynthia for the biography, Viv for the reading of the biography. And just thank you so much for coming in today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwirner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.